Hi, my name's Javan. I'm 23 years old, from London, and I'm a journalist.
I'm Jordan, I'm 28 and I'm from Camden.
Hey, I'm Hassan, I'm 29 years old, I'm a freelance copywriter from London.
Hi, I'm Alex, I'm 23 and I'm from London and I'm in my final year of my university degree.
Hi, I'm Jordan, I'm 21, I live in Croydon and I'm a freelance actor and dancer.
Hi, I'm James, I'm 21, from South East London and I'm a quantity surveyor.
Welcome to this episode of Own Your Future project by H&M and the Book of Man. This series is about helping people with their life and their career in a tough post-lockdown world. And I'm the mentor for this chat about self-belief and masculinity. So some research from the Book of Man says that the biggest barriers to changing people's employment status pointed to a lack of self-confidence and lack of motivation. So hopefully I can help with some of those issues as well. So we're going to go straight to questions with some of the guys here. And first we'll go to Javan.
Questions is that, do you think that people's cultural, beliefs and where they come from can affect how they perceive masculinity and mental health?
In each culture, there are different kind of expectations in terms of masculinity, in terms of mental health as well, because there's some cultures where it's very normal for men to come together and cry, but then some cultures where there's the expectation that men need to be stoic and strong and, not express themselves and not share their feelings. So I think, there's lots of differences, but then there's also largely lots of things that are the same as well. In a global society that we live in, we know that generally society is a male dominated or patriarchal society, but how that manifests just depends on where and when. And so I think you have to take everything really with a pinch of salt. And what that shows me is that if things are different in one place and then in another place, that means that we can create the reality of what we want to perceive when it comes to this masculinity thing. That's a great question.
That's good. That's deep. Thank you.
And so it's James. James, up.
I was wondering, who were some important role models for you growing up?
Like one of the biggest role models that I had was my basketball coach, Joe White. I played for, the team was known as London Towers. So I don't know if you guys are young enough to or follow basketball, but it was quite a big UK basketball team back in the day. I really loved basketball. I still love it. My dream as a 15-year-old boy was to make it to the NBA, to be the next Michael Jordan, Kobe Bryant, whoever it was. And in my mind at that time, I literally thought that was going to happen. Do you know what I mean? Young people, you have this belief that's almost it's almost ridiculous to a certain degree, but it's amazing. How can you think you're actually going to do that, right? Whether it's professional football, professional basketball, whatever it is. So that's what I believe. And so I remember my coach, he would do stuff like make us do maths tests at our training sessions, and he was talk to us about our careers outside of basketball. What do you want to be when you grow up? Focus on your education, these kind of things. Meanwhile, I'm a teenager thinking, I just want to play some basketball. Who cares about my education? Who cares about my career? And then actually, what we didn't realize was he was preparing us for not just basketball, but for the wider world. Career, professionalism, employment, etc., etc. And so when basketball didn't work out and I didn't become the next Michael Jordan, I still had a pathway for other things that I wanted to do. And I was able to find myself and to try different things and eventually get to where I am now.
That's pretty cool. So almost had a life coach from quite a young age without you even realizing it.
Exactly. And also he was someone that we could really talk to. It wasn't just the basketball, but if we had any personal stuff, he was feeling down, whatever it is, even other things that, for instance, I didn't have a passport, I didn't have citizenship because my family were refugees in this country growing up. We went to him, he helped with signing some of my papers and stuff. Do you know what I mean? And I think just little things like that helped me to have aspirations,
That's nice of him. Went beyond just his normal role there.
Exactly.
That's cool.
But yeah, it's a great question. Next up, we're going to Hassan.
Hi. So I thought I'd kind of break it down to the basics for the first question and ask, what does masculinity mean to you personally?
When you have like the way that masculinity is generally defined in the world is that you have to be strong, you have to dominate, or you have to have power over others. But actually, when you think about it, when you have a view of yourself that is actually open and really just about like the connections that you have in your personal relationships, that isn't based on like dominance or power, it allows you to live so much more freely and relaxed. And I remember going from that perception when I was younger, where it's like, yeah, you've got to be a man, you've got to be tough, and always constantly putting up this performance. And I was like, after a while, I was like, that's not me, man, you know? And it just felt so much more richer. Like my life has become richer because I've been able to connect with people. And so that's what masculinity really means to me. Like, it's that actual like personal connection.
Brilliant. No, that makes a lot of sense. I think a lot of us kind of want to hold up ourselves to a certain standard that we think we should have. But when you kind of let that go and just be, then that's where that freedom and authenticity comes through.
Absolutely. Absolutely, man. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
When it comes to sort of changing society for the better, I feel like a lot of people are either maybe in denial or they just want to shirk their sort of individual responsibilities. Do you think that's the only way to improve things, or should there be more being done sort of from the top down?
I mean, absolutely. There needs to be systemic change from the top down, because a lot of the ways in which we learn and we're socialized about these ideas that become harmful to our lives, that these negative ideas that are like perpetuate cycles of violence and aggression, comes from society, you know, comes from the institutions, come from the hierarchies like the media and the school system and government and the policies that impact our day-to-day life. So I think the change has to definitely come from like top down. But I also think that you know, power people in power often like trying to hold on to a power that's self-serving. And so in the absence of being able to create systemic change, like what can we do in our personal lives, in our family lives, in our communities to actually make those changes? And I say, like, you know, we're all likely a part of like some guy's group chat or not, right? And so it's like the little incremental changes. When something gets shared, like, what can we speak up about that we feel maybe a little bit shy to speak up about? What can we just kind of like put a stop to that gets spoken about too willy-nilly, that, you know, makes you feel uncomfortable, but you're not quite sure if it's going to like isolate you or this or that or the third. And so I always say, like, it's like, yes, there needs to be systemic change, but actually the kind of most fundamental change that we can really do in the meantime is how we actually act as individuals and how we kind of control the environment and influence the environment around us. So whether that's friends, that's family, at the dinner table and so forth. And it's a learning process, like it's a two-way learning process. And even like, you know, I have this with my parents. You know, my parents, you know, a lot more obviously traditional than I am. And, you know, my parents will be like, oh, my mum will be like, oh, you know, make sure you marry someone who can cook, for instance. And I'm like, no, we're both going to cook together, like, you know, that kind of stuff, you know. And so it's like that, when that was first said, she was kind of like, what? And then over the years, it's kind of like, oh, you know, that's not even a thing that gets said anymore. And so it's like, how do we influence each other in our day-to-day personal lives, but whilst waiting for systemic change? Because ultimately, it's narrative that changes us. Like, I want to improve because of the connections that I have with people around me, the people who I love, the people who I care for. So yeah, I think it's a two-way street, like it's twofold, you know. So whilst we're waiting for systemic things to change, there's things that we can do in our personal lives as well.
Yeah, definitely, man. I totally agree. Thank you.
How do you personally get rid of bad habits or negative behaviors and mindsets that you kind of spiral into when you've not achieved something that you want to achieve?
I really like this question because I feel like sometimes, especially in terms of like negative thoughts and bad habits, sometimes I feel like I overdo it, you know, and if I put so much effort into trying to correct that, like life would be so much easier if I didn't have to constantly work through these, right? And so for what I would say, firstly, is to be able to identify what it is that's causing the obstruction in your life in terms of like bad habits or negative thought patterns or behaviors. When you can identify that, write those down as a visual reminder of what it is. And there's like some of, you know, some kind of psychological concepts that you can use, challenging, confronting, and changing your thought patterns and behavior. So when you think about something, when there's a particular repetitive thought pattern that you have that's negative, like challenge it the moment that it comes into your mind, confront it, and then change it. And you have to really kind of like do that every single time. It's a real discipline, if you will. But I would say if it's at the point where you recognize that there's something wrong, but you're not really able to identify, or you feel like it's not something that you're able to overcome, I think therapy, it's in everyone's best interest to go to therapy. And sometimes that gets said like, you know, almost like flippantly, go to therapy, you need therapy. No, I think everyone needs therapy. Everyone would benefit from therapy. Everyone would benefit from like jogging once a week. Do you know what I mean? Like it would just generally make us healthier. We know that that's like generally like exercise is healthier for us, right? And so I think that, at least from my experience, what therapy has allowed me to do is to have a soundboard from which I can hear myself and what I'm saying almost like for the first time. Because for me, I realized that in my sessions of therapy, that was the only time where I actually like could speak uninterrupted for a whole hour without having to expect a response. And I found myself, after you get past the first, second, third sentence, you actually get to the core of what it is that you're saying, you know, and you hear yourself for the first time in certain things, and you catch things that you wouldn't otherwise catch. And then you're able to challenge those. But I think a lot of that challenging comes from like constant like discipline, like identification and discipline as well. And just constantly working through it. Like it's not going to be something that you fix in a month or 6 months or a year. It might be something that you work throughout, you know, a course of your life. Or it might be something that moves from one thing to another. But at each stage, whilst you're working towards it, I do feel like there's a certain level of empowerment that comes from being able to identify and actually like take some control over your own like behaviors, have some agency over your own existence. And I think that's so powerful.
Has it become easier to do over time?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's become easier. I see myself overthinking a situation and I can catch myself a lot quicker and I'm like, come on, you know, and I call myself out a lot quicker. Like I'm really direct with myself because I recognize the pattern and I could call myself out and I'm like, yeah. And it's almost like having another conversation and I'm like, yeah, you know what, you're right. That's on BS, you know? And so at each stage, it just becomes a little bit easier and you know what you're doing each time and it gets a little bit smoother. And then eventually, you know, you're able to develop those skills and move on from it and then use them in different ways.
Yeah, cool. Thanks.
Appreciate it. I hope that's helpful, man.
Yeah, it is helpful because I started therapy quite recently. So I've been like waiting because I can't afford to go privately, and it's hard. Like it's really hard. Like a lot of things that you've mentioned with your own experiences really resonate with me. Like I've got a lot of stuff that I have to unpack, but it is really hard being vulnerable with someone that you know you meet once a week for 50 minutes and you're like, yeah, why should I talk to you about this? But it does help. So yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I'm glad, man. Just keep going on your journey, you know, and you won't have any regrets. Like, and that's the thing. I feel like living the fullness of your human experience, like actually to be human, such a wonderful thing, that when you get to be vulnerable and you find people to be vulnerable with, whether that's your therapist or eventually you cultivate like a friendship kind of circle where you're all able to be vulnerable with each other, whether that's just like, that doesn't have to be a big group, like 1 or 2 people. You know, I think that is like, wow, it's almost like sparks go off and you can really be yourself, you know. So yeah, just keep going on your journey, man.
Thank you, man.
Right, next up, Jordan Fairchild.
Oh man, how you doing?
I'm good. How are you, Jordan?
Not too bad, man. So I was going to ask, when it comes to personal progression, how do you kind of find a good middle ground between looking at yourself negatively and positively, like giving yourself constructive criticism?
Yeah. One thing I've learned not to do over the years is to compare myself with others. And, you know, I feel like that's a bigger issue now more than ever. Especially for kind of younger people, if you're in your teenage years, early 20s, all of the stuff that like you see on social media, especially like Instagram, where people are jet setting around the world and, you know, private jets and like, you know, they've got all these fancy cars and all these clothes and stuff. And I'm like, how are you 21 years old and you're driving this car? And then, you know, and it makes you feel some kind of way as well. Like, and the thing is, it's like this generation is growing up with an exposure to materialism that like my generation just didn't. Like I'm in my like early 30s, or well, actually, I'm approaching my mid 30s now. I'm 34 basically. And it's like in my day, I mean, it wasn't really a thing where you were judged to whether or not you drove a car and what kind of car you drove. You know, now I'm seeing like young teenagers even financing like these really expensive cars and stuff. And I'm like, whoa, you know, that's a lot of pressure to have. And so one thing I try not to do, and I always encourage others to do, is not to compare yourself. Everyone is on their own journey in life and it happens at different paces. And one of the things is if you compare yourself, if you rush the journey, if you rush the process, you miss out on so many things, you know, so many things that is actually going to be formative to you and to who you are and who you will be. And I think about, you know, my own experience, like I never intended to become a writer or an author. Like I just didn't imagine these things happening for me, especially when I was 21, you know. So I think about if I had rushed that journey at that age, trying to be like everyone else, I wouldn't have been able to experience who I am and the reality and what I'm able to offer now as well. And even if I weren't doing this, I think there's a certain amount of peace, especially like that comes from inside, that you can't get it from anywhere else, right? That comes from inside, just peace and contentment from like knowing who you are and being satisfied with what you're doing. And there isn't, that doesn't come down to career, that doesn't come down to, you know, how much money you have or where you live or what house or what car or whatever. That's all inside, you know. And I think that's the main thing, is like being able to cultivate that internal peace. Like imagine your internal world is a garden. Like what are you doing to cultivate that garden, you know? And I think that's the thing that I try to do the most every day. And I'm naturally someone who's I can be like overly critical, you know, really overly negative sometimes with my thoughts. And that's something that I've spoken with in terms of like the conversations that I've had with my therapist. And actually what you realize is that negativity and that criticism, especially that self-criticism, isn't even your own voice. You know, sometimes it can be like the residue of voices from other people in your life, other like that teacher who you didn't like and so forth, or, you know, that person who's low-key a hater, but that's because they hate themselves and it's not really about you. Do you know what I mean? Like, and so you have to think about what other voices have I internalized that's made me feel this badly about myself, and then get rid of those voices and actually like really cultivate your own voice and bring out your own self. And I think like for me, that's what I try to do. I mean, it's an everyday process. I still struggle with it. Sometimes I'm like, come on, man, and, you know, you need to do this, you need to be more. And other days I'm like, no, you're exactly where you need to be for whatever it is that you've got to do. Trust the process. Yeah.
No, that's perfect, man. I mean, for something like you mentioned, obviously being at the age of 21, like I was 21 this year. So that is honestly the perfect kind of advice for someone that, you said at that point. So now, obviously, you told me how you felt. Like, yeah, perfectly. Like, looking at it, that's how I'm starting to feel. So, no, it's a good answer, man. Thank you so much.
Man, and then this is the thing, especially the 20s, right? There's so much pressure in your 20s that you're supposed to be at a certain stage, you're supposed to have a certain career, you're supposed to, you know, have a certain amount of money, etc., relationships as well. And I felt that pressure too. Like, I remember, like, mid to late 20s as well, I went to, like, suddenly all my friends were either getting married or having kids. And there I was, like, single, living at my mum's, like, broke. And I was like, what am I doing with my life? And I remember putting so much pressure on myself, unnecessary pressure, to the point where I didn't enjoy my everyday. And then I turned 30, and then I was like, I need to let go of this because this isn't healthy. And then the more people I spoke to who were 30 plus, 40 plus, 50 plus, was just like, mate, no one's got the answer when it comes to life. No one really knows what they're doing. We're all just winging it. We're all just trying, you know? And some things might happen sooner for some people, and some things will happen later for other people. That's fine, you know? And then that will give you a lot of peace of mind. So if you can capture that peace of mind at 21, like, you're good to go. You're good to go. Or whatever stage, not even 21, 31, 41, because there's a lot of people who go through the years of their life and they don't ever get that peace of mind. And I feel like that's such an unfortunate waste, you know?
Yeah, man, I get you. But yeah, I'm trying my best. I'm going to try and get that mindset. Keep it going.
Yeah, man. One day at a time.
Yeah, man.
So you mentioned you were talking about masculinity a bit in a previous question. But I just wanted to add, like, if you were able to have one uniform description of what masculinity should be, and it should be in a dictionary, what would you put in?
You know what? I would say for me, I want to get to the stage where masculinity doesn't have a definition. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think for so long, we've lived in a world where masculinity, or the definition of it, has been like enforced and imposed on us, right? And I think, okay, what would actually be helpful to us? Do we need a new definition of masculinity? Maybe. But for me, I think, like, I could say, I want the definition of masculinity to be this, this, and this, right? But then someone else will be like, nah, that doesn't really fit into what I think masculinity is. And so for me, I'm like, actually, like, I want it to be able to be something that's, like, without definition, that's fluid, really, you know, because it could be that, like, my masculinity is that, you know, I wear bright colors, right? Do you know what I mean? That's my thing. I wear bright colors. Or I got one of my friends, he's a musician, he paints his nails, right? Paints his nails and, you know, all of that stuff. Like, his nails are flat, like, it's all done. Like, for him, that's what fits in his construct of masculinity. He does that. If he was to say everyone should paint their nails and that's your version of masculinity, I wouldn't be comfortable with that because I don't paint my nails, you know? But we have different versions of masculinity. And so for me, I think it should be something that is, like, fluid, and people should be able to perceive it and construct it in a way that's actually healthy. And so I think it's like, how do we have a healthy version of masculinity that isn't predicated upon a specific rigid definition, but more so allows us all to really live in the fullness, like, of who we are. And so we feel comfortable, because we've all been there, especially as young men. Like, you know what I mean? Like, you're in certain spaces and you're like, I don't know if I should do this or say that because it's going to break the code or whatever. And then so you repress yourself, right? And then we think about how much you lose over the years. You're constantly repressing yourself. And so I more want to think about it from the other side, is how much can we actually give from allowing ourselves to be open and to be free, and so forth and so forth and so forth. So yeah, that's what I would say. It's like, just let it breathe, be fluid, you know. It's like water. Like, what is masculine like? It's like water. You know, like Bruce Lee does, I don't know if you've read the Bruce Lee speeches, he's talking about be like water. I love, like, I think it's on YouTube, but that whole concept of like be like water is amazing, because water is just the most fluid. It goes into all 4 fluid states, you know, and so it's like that should be the fluidity of masculinity as well, like that it can exist without definition.
That's cool, man. That's deep. That's true, because masculinity, it needs to be more. It's not one way. It should be, you know, multiple ways, because not everyone's the same. Everyone has different opinions and different ways. So that's cool, man. Thank you.
Absolutely. Appreciate it, man.
I was wondering just how you deal with any sort of low points in your life, anything that you've gone through, just any sort of like, mechanisms and stuff like that.
The first thing I would say is I try to journal. So I've definitely, you know, had my fair share of low points in my life. And even now in the past year, like really been challenged with so many things. But I would say journaling is very helpful to me, for me to like express myself and to get things off my chest, really. So that's one thing that's been useful. Another thing is finding someone who, you know, I can talk to in confidence, you know, whether that's a friend, whether that's a mentor, someone older, someone younger, whoever it is, just being able to like have a conversation with someone that allows me to be vulnerable, but I constantly don't have to have my guard up. And I'd highly recommend that. And other things is like, I think this is probably one of the most impactful thing is like really looking after yourself, right? And I mean that in terms of like your mental health, your emotional health, but also like your day-to-day kind of health as well, right? So for example, like a young man's room versus a young woman's room, right? It's like a young man's room is just like mattress. That's it. Right? Do you know what I mean? Boom. No blanket, no pillows, or maybe one pillow. Mattress, done. That's all you need, you know? And that's not healthy. That's not healthy. You know, you go, you shower, and then you just use like the most basic, you know, like shampoo and conditioner in one. Like
all
you don't
body wash,
like all in one. Like the most basic thing, one towel that you've had since you were 12. Like that is the bare minimum, you know, and that's not healthy, right? And so I think about little things like bubble baths, candles lit, dipping the oils in, face masks, scent like incense burning, all of these things, these daily kind of like practices, daily, weekly, monthly practices. And, you know, you have to find what works for you, because if I say do all of these things and do it at once, you might not enjoy it, you know, but you have to just find what works for you. Maybe going on a long walk, some fresh air, being around nature, being around water, etc. So what I say is like self-care, try to find the ways in which you can best take care of yourself so that you can feel rejuvenated and have a bit of energy. In a low mood or you're hitting a low point, sometimes it can feel a bit too familiar to stay there. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then that low point becomes the new norm. And then something else will happen. It will take you a little bit lower. And then you almost don't know how to feel happy again. And then it's like, when you do feel happy again, you're almost scared, right? Because it's like, well, I've been accustomed to feeling a low point for so long. When's the next low point? So you're not even thinking about, here I am in this place where I'm happy. You're thinking about, well, how long is this happiness going to last? The next low point is going to come. So let me just prepare myself for the low point. And that is not really a healthy thing, you know? And so really just try to find ways to like take care of yourself, to take care of like the people around you. Because I guarantee you that whatever you're going through, that you feel like you're going through alone, your best mates are all going through it in one way or another. It's the conversation isn't happening to connect those experiences. And so if you can find a way to take care of yourself, but also take care of each other, do the things that make you feel less alone, like that is, that's life-changing, man. That's life-changing. And there's and also, to add to that, there's a reason why women live longer. That's because they take care of themselves.
Like that. That's good. No, that's good words. Thank you. It's interesting what you're saying about the journal as well. I've heard that come up a few times with some different people. Who was it? I was listening to a podcast, Matthew McConaughey, the actor.
Yeah.
Every time he's been at his most like creative is when he was doing his like daily journal. That come up a few different times. So it's quite interesting you said that as well.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Absolutely. And also keep them, right? Keep your journals. And then when a year, 6 months, a year, 2 years, 3 years, whatever passes, it's always really interesting to look back and then read what you're writing. Because what happens is like that thing that you thought was like huge, right? Like you read back 2 years later and you're like, I don't really remember that. You know, like that's not that big. Like, why did I feel so? Do you know what I mean? You pass through certain stages and you realize that the burden that you was carrying, you've gone through it. You've been able to move on from it. And so you realize that life is a constant moving on from things and being able to like move forward. So
that's cool.
Yeah. Grab a journal.
Thanks for that.
No problem. We'll make a
jump
great
on it.
Yeah, do it. Hassan, back to you.
So, like you mentioned, there's a kind of a expectation that masculinity is kind of rooted in aggression and strength and power, and can then veer into that toxic aspects of that, where people feel they have to kind of overcompensate. So, I was wondering, is for people out there, for guys out there who are kind of resistant or hesitant to take a look at their own expressions of masculinity, what is a good place for them to start that kind of introspection to see they could improve or change things and make things better for themselves?
I always kind of say to people is, who are you when you're alone, right? Like, who are you when you're in your room late at night by yourself, no one's around you, you're not on social media, you're not on the phone to someone, etc., etc. Like, who are you by yourself when you first wake up in the morning, when you look in the mirror? Like, who is that person? And the thing is we don't get this chance to sit with ourselves really long enough to be able to ask ourselves that question. And so for me, I think getting someone who's quite resistant to it is about opening that space to them to say, look, man, I'm not trying to force any ideas on you. I'm just trying to get you to, you know, sit with yourself, forget about me. The focus is on you. Sit with yourself and ask yourself who you are and how you're feeling. And I tell you, I've had moments where, like, you know, some of the young people that I've worked with, who, like, the very second after coming out of a fight, do you know what I mean? And, you know, they've literally just beat up some boy in the playground, this, that, the third. And we sit down and we have a conversation. And it goes from this raging aggression to suddenly this like softness and wanting to be cared for. And I think deep down inside, we all have that because it's a fundamental human thing. And so what I think the key is not necessarily trying to force them to accept this thing, but rather to guide them along the journey. You know, it's just like, look, this is a path, or you can create your own path. But it's up to us, it's up to them to walk. And whether it takes 6 months, whether it takes a year, whether it takes 10 years, like, that's them on their journey. And I think the best that we can do is just kind of like support someone through that, you know. And I've got some of my like closest friends that I grew up with who 5-10 years ago, man, 5-10 years ago, I was the guy who was like, JJ, you talk too much about this thing. Like, if we get it, I was like, all right, cool. Now they're like, you know, I really, you know? Yeah. And it's like, I feel really proud. Like, I feel really like, yeah, it's strengthened our friendships. And so, yeah, I think that's, for me, that's, at least that's what I find has worked for me.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I think giving people that assurance that they can let their guard down and giving that space is really important. And like you mentioned, like, nowadays, everything is so fast moving that we don't give people that opportunity. So it's really important to kind of approach it through that aspect, definitely.
And there's also like way more pressure now to get things, to have the right opinion.
Yeah.
Right. And to be seen as like, you know, being a person who's more progressive than the other person, as if we all didn't make some mistakes at some point, or we all didn't have some toxic thinking at some point. Like, if you lot would have met me at 16, never mind the bad fashion, like, yo, like, I would have been wearing jeans down to my ankles and like hoodies from, do you know what I mean? Like, it would have been, like, I'm just glad that we didn't have any pictures in those days, because I don't really have much evidence to be embarrassed about, you know? And so when I look at like and speak to young people now, I'm like, I try to speak with people from a place of understanding that the environment a lot of us grow up in, regardless of whether it's like inner city or poverty or whatever, it could be middle class as well. Like, there's so much toxicity that we have to unlearn, you know, and so we need time to be able to do that. It's not just an instant thing, you know?
Yeah, I think giving people that opportunity to grow and learn is something that sometimes we kind of forget. Everyone's just like quick to be like condemning, but not willing to let people learn from it and actually implement what we're trying to spread anyway.
Exactly, man.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Appreciate it. To all you guys, you know, keep going, man. If you lot want to drop me an email or got any further questions or whatever, I think like my socials are out there. So yeah, you know, don't be shy to get in touch. I'll be happy to help how I can.
Nice,
yeah.
man.
Thank you so much. Cheers, man.
Yeah, guys.
Cheers, man. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.